The hydraulic catapult hissed at 05:23 hours, and Lieutenant Jack Morrison felt his F6F Hellcat lurch forward with acceleration that turned his vision grey at the edges. The carrier USS Lexington fell away beneath him as he climbed into pre-dawn darkness over the Philippine Sea, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine thundering with power that you felt through your entire body, 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower that transformed 50 tons of metal and fuel and ammunition into something that could fly. The smell of aviation fuel and salt air mixed with the peculiar scent of heated oil that came from pushing an engine hard, the combination so familiar after 2 years of carrier operations that Morrison barely noticed it anymore. Behind him, the flight deck erupted into controlled chaos as another Hellcat launched, then another, the catapults firing in sequence every 40 seconds, spotting aircraft for launch, while recovering others from the combat air patrol that had been circling since midnight. Morrison banked left into the rendezvous circle, watching his wingman ensign Tommy Park slide into position off his right wing, the kid's Hellcat tucking in close with the precision that came from 6 months of flying together. "Blue flight, check in," Morrison called over the radio. "Blue 2, Blue 3, Blue 4. 4 Hellcats in tight formation, climbing through 5,000 feet, part of a much larger strike package assembling in the darkness. Morrison could see navigation lights from other fighters scattered across the sky, green wingtip lights blinking against black void, dozens of aircraft forming up for what intelligence was calling the biggest carrier battle since Midway. The briefing 3 hours ago had been crowded, standing room only in Lexington's ready room. Pilots packed shoulder to shoulder, while the air intelligence officer pointed at maps and photographs pinned to the bulkhead. The Japanese had committed their remaining carrier force to defending the Marianas. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, escorted by destroyers and supported by land-based aircraft from Guam and Rota. Over 450 Japanese aircraft versus Task Force 58's 900 American planes. But the numbers didn't tell the real story. "Their pilots are green," the intelligence officer had said, tapping a photograph of a Zero fighter. "Most have less than 200 flight hours. They're flying the same aircraft they flew at Midway, while you're flying Hellcats with better armor, better guns, better everything. Our radar can see them coming from 100 miles out. They'll be attacking into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with proximity-fused shells, and you'll be waiting for them at altitude with speed and position advantage." Someone had laughed, nervous energy that rippled through the crowded room. Morrison hadn't laughed. He'd been at Midway, had flown F4F Wildcats when the Japanese still had their best pilots and their aura of invincibility. He'd watched too many friends die to treat any enemy casually, no matter what intelligence said about pilot quality or aircraft performance. "Don't get cocky," he'd told his division afterward. "They're still dangerous. Every Zero you meet might have a veteran pilot who'll kill you if you make a mistake. Fly your aircraft, use your advantages, stay in pairs, and we'll all go home." The sun rose at 06 to 12 hours, turning the eastern sky from black to grey to orange gold. The ocean appeared beneath them, endless blue stretching to the horizon in every direction, marked only by the white wakes of ships, the massive carrier task force steaming west toward the Marianas, toward whatever the Japanese were sending to meet them. "All fighters, this is Lexington CIC," the radio crackled with the voice of the Combat Information Center officer. "We have multiple bogies inbound, bearing 270, range 150 miles, high altitude. Vector 300 for intercept. Bandits estimated at raid strength plus." Raid strength plus. That meant over 50 aircraft, probably more. Morrison felt his stomach tighten, the familiar pre-combat tension that made your hands sweat and your mouth go dry. He checked his instruments. Fuel good, oil pressure normal, coolant temperature in the green, all 6 50 caliber machine guns armed and ready with 2,400 rounds of ammunition. The Hellcat responded to control inputs with solid precision, no sloppiness in the controls, the big fighter feeling heavy and powerful in ways the old Wildcat never had. Blue flight, increase speed to 250 knots, climb to Angels 20, he ordered, pushing his throttle forward. The R-2800 responded instantly, the nose rising as the Hellcat climbed through 10,000 feet, through 15,000, through 18,000, heading for 20,000 feet, where they'd have altitude advantage over any attacking force. The air grew thin and cold at altitude. Morrison turned on cockpit heat, but it barely helped. The canopy was frosting at the edges, his breath fogging despite the oxygen flowing through his mask. Below, the task force was barely visible, just tiny grey shapes against blue water, their anti-aircraft guns already tracking skyward in preparation for what was coming. "Contact! Bandits at 11 o'clock high, Angels 25. The call came from one of the radar-equipped night fighters operating at extreme altitude, their powerful radars able to see enemy formations while they were still miles away. Morrison scanned the sky, searching, and then he saw them, dark specks against pale blue sky, growing larger as the range closed. Not 50 aircraft, more like 70 or 80, maybe more. A massive formation of Japanese carrier aircraft heading straight for the American fleet. He could identify types as they grew clearer. Vals, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, Kates, Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, Judys, Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, all of them escorted by Zeros and some of the newer Zeeks. "Tally-ho," Morrison called. "Blue flight, selecting Zeros on the left flank. Attack in pairs, maintain mutual support." He picked his target, a Zero at the edge of the enemy formation, slightly separated from its wingman. Classic mistake, and Morrison intended to exploit it. He rolled inverted and pulled, entering a split S-dive that brought him down on the Zero's tail with 100 knots of speed advantage. The Japanese pilot didn't see him until Morrison was already in firing position at 400 yards. The 650 calibers opened up, the recoil vibrating through the airframe, tracers reaching out to touch the Zero's fuselage. Pieces flew off. Fabric from the control surfaces, metal from the engine cowling. The Zero banked hard right, trying to turn inside the Hellcat's turn radius, but Morrison didn't follow. He pulled up and away, gaining altitude and speed, using the Hellcat's superior power to disengage before the Zero could get a shot. Park was on the Zero's tail within seconds, his guns hammering, the Japanese fighter suddenly streaming fuel and smoke. The Zero rolled over and fell, spinning, the pilot either dead or unconscious, the aircraft doomed. "Splash one!" Park's voice was high with adrenaline and excitement, his first kill. But there was no time to celebrate, because the sky was suddenly full of aircraft. American fighters tearing into the Japanese formation from every angle, Zeros and dive bombers breaking apart under concentrated fire, the air thick with tracers and gunsmoke and aircraft tumbling toward the ocean. Morrison reversed hard left and found himself looking at a Kate torpedo bomber flying straight and level, its rear gunner firing wildly at targets he probably couldn't see clearly. Morrison fired from dead astern, a 3-second burst that tore through the Kate's tail and walked forward into the fuselage. The bomber exploded, the torpedo under its belly detonating in a fireball that consumed the aircraft instantly. Morrison flew through the debris field, feeling impacts on his wings and fuselage, but the Hellcat kept flying, kept responding to controls, built tough enough to absorb battle damage that would have killed a Zero. The battle spread across 30 miles of sky, individual engagements happening simultaneously at different altitudes, different positions, all of it happening so fast that conscious thought became impossible. Morrison operated on training and instinct, his hands and feet working controls without conscious input, his eyes scanning constantly for threats, his mind processing information faster than he could articulate it. He got his third kill 10 minutes into the engagement, a Judy dive bomber that tried to evade by pulling into a climbing turn but didn't have the power to maintain speed. Morrison closed to 200 yards and fired, watching his rounds stitch across the bomber's wing route. The wing folded upward, tore free, and the Judy tumbled out of control, spinning end over end toward the ocean. "Blue leader, you've got a Zero on your 6, Park's voice, urgent. Morrison broke hard right, pulled 6 Gs, felt his vision tunnel as blood drained from his head. The Zero flashed past where he'd been, its 20mm cannons firing, tracers bright even in daylight. Morrison reversed left and found himself in a turning fight, exactly what the briefing had warned against. The Zero could turn tighter, could bleed speed in ways that would stall a Hellcat, but the Hellcat had power, and the Hellcat pilot had experience. Morrison didn't try to outturn the Zero. He traded altitude for speed, pushed into a dive that took him away from the fight but built up airspeed. The Zero followed, its pilot good enough to stay with him through the initial maneuver. But at 400 knots the Hellcat could pull out of the dive more aggressively, could use vertical maneuvers that stressed the Zero's lighter airframe. Morrison pulled up hard, trading speed for altitude, felt the Hellcat shudder on the edge of a stall, then kicked rudder and snap rolled over the top. The Zero tried to follow but couldn't match the maneuver. Morrison found himself above and behind, perfect shooting position, fired a burst that caught the Zero in the engine. Oil sprayed across the windscreen, the engine seized, and the Zero nosed down, trailing black smoke. The pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just before impact with the water. 4 kills in 20 minutes. Morrison's gun counters showed he'd fired maybe 900 rounds, still plenty of ammunition left. Around him, the battle continued, but was clearly tilting in the Americans' favor. Japanese aircraft were falling everywhere, burning or broken, trailing smoke on their way to the ocean. Some American aircraft were damaged, a few going down, but the ratio was overwhelming. 10 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss, maybe more. All fighters, this is Lexington CIC, second wave inbound, bearing 265, range 120 miles, raid strength ++, vector 280 for intercept. ++ meant over 100 aircraft. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at the American fleet, wave after wave, trying to overwhelm the defences through sheer numbers. But each wave ran into fighters that were faster, more heavily armed, flown by pilots with better training and better intelligence. The Hellcats were slaughtering them. Morrison reformed his division, all 4 aircraft still flying, though Park's Hellcat had taken several hits to the tail section and headed toward the next intercept point. His fuel was at 60%, enough for another engagement and return to the carrier. His ammunition was at 40%. His hands were steady on the controls, but fatigue was building, the adrenaline crash making everything feel slightly unreal. The second wave was even larger than the first, over 130 aircraft in a massive formation that stretched across miles of sky. Morrison climbed to 25,000 feet with 50 other Hellcats, positioning for a high-side attack that would give them maximum speed advantage. The Japanese formation was lower, at 18,000 feet, plodding along with bombing altitude, but without the fighter escort strength to protect them. "Execute!" The strike leader's voice was calm, professional. 50 Hellcats rolled over and dove, achieving speeds approaching 450 knots, tearing into the Japanese formation like wolves into sheep. Morrison selected a Judy dive bomber, closed to 300 yards, fired a burst that hit the engine and cockpit. The bomber nosed over immediately, out of control, falling. He pulled up, selected another target, a Zero trying to intercept him, fired, missed. The Zero snapped right, and Morrison followed, this time not trying to turn with it, but maintaining speed, pulling lead, firing into the Zero's turn. His rounds walked across the wing and fuselage. The Zero shuddered, rolled inverted, fell. 5 kills, ace in a single day. The thought barely registered. There was no time for counting, no mental space for anything except the immediate tactical situation. Another Judy ahead, closed to 200 yards, fired. The Judy's wing came apart, shredded by 50 caliber rounds, 6 kills. Park got 2 more, his guns working perfectly, his flying improving with each engagement. The other 2 pilots in the division got 1 each. Blue Flight's total was 11 confirmed kills with 3 probables, and the day wasn't over. The third wave came at 1330 hours, smaller than the first two, only about 80 aircraft, but including some of the newer George fighters, Kawanishi N1K2J Shiden Kai, that were supposed to be better than Zeros. They weren't better than Hellcats. Morrison got his 7th kill when a George tried to engage him in a head-on pass. The Japanese pilot fired too early, his rounds passing harmlessly under Morrison's aircraft. Morrison held fire until 400 yards, then triggered a 2-second burst that tore through the George's cockpit. The fighter snap-rolled left and fell, no pilot at the controls. By 1500 hours, the battle was effectively over. The Japanese had launched 4 major strikes, over 350 aircraft, and lost approximately 315 of them. American losses were fewer than 30 aircraft, most of those to anti-aircraft fire from their own ships or operational accidents. The carrier task force was virtually undamaged. A few ships had taken minor hits, but nothing serious, nothing that would affect operations. Morrison trapped aboard Lexington at 1547 hours, the arresting cable jerking his Hellcat to a halt with deceleration that threw him forward against his harness. He shut down the engine and sat for a moment in sudden silence, his hands shaking now that the action was over, his body flooded with fatigue and the aftermath of sustained combat. The plane captain climbed up to help him out of the cockpit. 7 kills, sir. Is that right? Morrison nodded, not trusting his voice. 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day. 7 pilots dead or captured. 7 families in Japan who would receive notification that their sons or husbands were missing. The mathematics of war reduced to simple arithmetic, numbers on a tally board that represented human beings who'd woken up that morning and gone to war and never come home. The debriefing lasted 3 hours, intelligence officers recording every detail of each engagement, building a comprehensive picture of the battle. Morrison described his kills, identified aircraft types, estimated altitudes and speeds, tried to convey the chaos and the clarity of combat in ways that made sense to people who hadn't been there. The preliminary numbers were staggering. The Japanese had lost approximately 315 aircraft destroyed and over 200 pilots killed or missing. They'd sunk 0 American ships, damaged a few, but sunk none. It was the most lopsided air-sea battle in history, the moment when Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. "They're calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot," the intelligence officer said, trying for levity but getting only tired nods from the assembled pilots. "The papers back home are going to love this story." Morrison didn't respond. He was thinking about the Zero pilot who'd bailed out, the parachute opening just in time, the man probably drowning or dying of exposure in the vast Pacific because there was no one to rescue him. He was thinking about the Kate that had exploded, the crew incinerated instantly, dying without ever knowing what hit them. He was thinking about how easy it had been, how one-sided, how the Japanese had sent young pilots with minimal training into combat against American aviators who'd been flying for years, who had better aircraft and better tactics and every possible advantage. It wasn't fair, but war wasn't supposed to be fair. War was supposed to be won, and the side that trained harder, equipped better, and fought smarter was the side that won. The Americans had done all three, and the result was what military historians would later call the decisive engagement of the Pacific Carrier War, the battle that broke Japanese naval aviation beyond repair. Morrison flew 2 more missions over the next 3 days, strikes against Japanese air bases in the Marianas, shooting down 2 more Zeros and destroying several aircraft on the ground. His final tally for the operation was 9 confirmed kills, making him one of the top-scoring pilots in Task Force 58. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony 2 weeks later, stood at attention while the Admiral pinned the medal on his uniform and said words about courage and skill and duty. He didn't feel courageous. He felt tired. Tired of killing. Tired of war. Tired of watching young men die because they'd been sent into combat unprepared and outmatched. The Japanese pilots he'd killed in the Marianas Turkey Shoot weren't warriors. They were sacrifices. thrown into battle by commanders who knew they couldn't win but ordered attacks anyway because the alternative was admitting defeat. Park was killed 2 months later during operations off the Philippines, shot down by anti-aircraft fire while strafing a Japanese airfield. He was 22 years old. His Hellcat crashed into the jungle, and no one ever recovered his body. Morrison wrote the letter to Park's parents, tried to explain that their son had been brave and skilled and had died quickly, painlessly. He didn't mention that he'd watched Park's aircraft explode, had seen pieces falling toward the green canopy below, had known instantly that no one could have survived. The war ended in August 1945, atomic bombs and Soviet invasion and Japanese surrender happening in quick succession. Morrison was still flying combat missions when the ceasefire was announced, still hunting targets that suddenly became non-targets, still processing the abrupt transition from war to peace. He flew his Hellcat off the carrier one last time in September, landing at a naval air station in California, shutting down the engine and walking away from the aircraft without looking back. He stayed in the Navy until 1963, flying jets and eventually commanding a carrier air group. But he never stopped thinking about those 3 days in June 1944, when Task Force 58 had achieved absolute air superiority over the Philippine Sea. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that trivialized what had been a slaughter, turned mass death into something that sounded like sport. In 1972, Morrison attended a reunion of Lexington veterans in San Diego. 70 men gathered in a hotel conference room, drinking and telling stories, trying to recapture something that existed only in memory. Someone asked him about the turkey shoot, wanted to hear about his 7 kills in one day, wanted the story told the way it appeared in books and documentaries, American pilots heroically defeating the enemy through superior skill and courage. Morrison drank his whiskey and tried to find words. "It wasn't heroic," he said finally. "It was necessary. We had better aircraft, better training, better intelligence, better everything. They sent kids up in obsolete fighters to face us, and we killed them by the hundreds. That's not heroism. That's just war. We won because we were better prepared, not because we were better men." The room fell silent. Someone changed the subject. The party continued, but Morrison left early, walked back to his hotel through warm California night, thinking about Zero pilots spiraling down, thinking about burning aircraft, thinking about the peculiar guilt that comes from surviving when so many others didn't. He died in 1998, 76 years old, survived by his wife and 3 children who knew him as a quiet man who'd served in the war but rarely discussed it. They found his logbook while sorting through his belongings, discovered he'd flown 187 combat missions, had been credited with 14 confirmed kills and 7 probables. His medals were in a box in the garage, tarnished and forgotten. At his funeral, 2 other Hellcat pilots attended, old men now, bent and grey, their numbers diminishing each year as age claimed what combat hadn't. They stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, each lost in private memories of battles fought 6 decades ago, but never truly finished. One of them placed a small model F6F Hellcat on the casket before they closed it, a gesture that felt inadequate but necessary, a symbol of something that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. The plane stayed with Morrison when they buried him, a tiny representation of the machine that had kept him alive through 3 years of war, that had turned him from a pilot into a killer, that had carried him through battles that would be remembered as great victories but felt like something else entirely to the men who'd fought them. On the bottom of the Pacific, scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean floor, lie the wrecks of over 300 Japanese aircraft that went down during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Their crews are still there, still inside the broken aircraft, preserved by cold water and darkness, waiting for nothing, because there's nothing left to wait for. The ocean keeps their memory, as it keeps all memories, silently, completely, without judgment. And somewhere in that darkness, among the wreckage of Zeros and Judys and Kates, lies the truth that no victory parade ever captures, that wars are won by young men killing other young men, that superiority in battle comes from better preparation rather than better souls, and that the cost of victory is measured not in medals awarded, but in ghosts carried. The sky remembers them too. It always has.